It happened late last night, around 7:30, so it was pretty dark outside. My friend and I, both 22, female, were about 2/3 of the way through our 16-hour drive back from Salem, Massachusetts. I really needed to pee, so we stopped at a rest area in eastern Pennsylvania. I usually avoid rest areas, but it looked nice enough, and I didn't really have any bad feelings about it. We walked into only one other person inside, who was an older man, probably in his late 60s, standing by the vending machine talking on his phone. We went past him across the room into the bathroom. We were in there for a good 10 to 15 minutes because she wanted to pop a couple pimples. We walked back out laughing at something one of us had said. The man was standing there, but he wasn't on the phone anymore. He stared and smiled at us the entire time it took us to get to the door and exit the rest area. We started running back to the car, which was about 6 parking spaces from the door. We were still laughing, but also a little freaked out. We were about to get back in the car when I remembered that my boyfriend wanted us to check the oil on the way, since it was such a long drive, and the car had been having some slight issues. I considered waiting until next time we needed to stop for gas, but decided to just get it over with. As I was checking the oil, the man from before, along with a slightly younger man we hadn't seen, left the rest area. They both started walking towards us, with the younger one coming head on the sidewalk, and the older one kind of diagonally towards the driver's side of the car. This struck me as odd because there's no other cars past mine. The only cars I could see were on the other side of the lot. My friend and I looked at each other and bolted for the car doors, but then I realized I was still holding the dipstick, so I cursed and we had to run back over and lift the hood back up. We hurried into the car and locked the doors just as they were approaching. We watched the younger man walk slowly past my car, staring in at us with a blank face. He continued walking down the sidewalk for a while, pausing for a second and turning around to come back towards us. The older man, still just smiling, got within a few feet of the driver's side door, then turned and walked past to the other side of the parking lot. I backed out, and once I straightened out the car and started pulling forward to leave the rest area, we saw that he had moved to the middle of the road and was just standing there with the same unnerving smile. But now he was motioning for us to stop. I drove past him because, no way. We watched in the mirrors as both men got into their cars on the other side of the parking lot that was closer to the building. We spent the next couple hours shaking up and babbling about what could have happened. I'm not sure what their intentions were, but there can't be a good reason to approach 2 women like that at a rest area. I tried telling myself maybe they were going to ask us if we needed help with our car troubles, but I was clearly just checking the oil. And it doesn't make sense why the younger man would just walk the complete opposite direction from his car and go so far down the sidewalk. So I'm not really sure. I had to drive to my parents' place a few hours away and back today. I pulled over halfway. It's about a 5-hour drive one way. I needed to use the restroom and stretch my legs. The lot was fairly empty. A semi-truck, 2 other vehicles, a young family at one of the tables, nothing weird. I go into the ladies' room. All the stalls are free. I pick my stall and start doing my thing. Someone comes in and picks a stall next to me. All the other stalls are still empty. Then they start whistling this creepy tune. That's when I realized that they're standing to pee. They could be trans and using the right restroom, but the creepy whistling was what got to me. And why I picked the stall right next to me when there were 9 other empty stalls. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to make me significantly paranoid. Cut my time short, washed my hands, and booked it before they even left the stall. A highway rest stop is not where I plan on dying. So my grandma and I decided to drive from Illinois to Oklahoma City to visit my dad. We made it there, and I got to see a lot of my family that I had not seen in years, I lived in Oklahoma for 6 years. On the way home, my grandma asked me to pull over at the next rest stop, and I obliged. It was in the middle of a bright spring day. We both got out and headed to the ladies' room. I noticed a guy standing behind a tree just staring. It gave me the creeps, but I didn't give it another thought. My grandma gave me a shout telling me that she was going back to the car. I finished up and headed outside. Creepy guy was still standing behind the tree. I walked a little faster and he started pacing me. I was about to scream when a family came around the corner to use the bathroom. It was enough to make him leave me alone. We got back on the road, and about a mile down there was a roadblock. They were stopping everyone because they were looking for some seriously deranged psychopath. I told them to check the rest stops in hopes that they would catch him. It gives me chills thinking about it today. I was only 21 at the time, but I wasn't naive. I thank that family, even though they didn't even know what happened. So to the psycho at the rest stop in Missouri, I hope we never meet again. So I was driving by myself on a highway in Maine, cranking killer tunes, slamming Mountain Dew big gulps, and sucking back the American Spirit lights. Decided to go hog wild at a Taco Bell drive-thru and ordered an enormous amount of food, extra fixins. So I devoured the Taco Bell, had the full menu of sorts, live Moss. Of course, about 40 minutes after I ate, my stomach began seizing and cramping. There's gonna be no refunds, no returns. Luckily, I see a rest stop coming up in 2 miles, so I floored it and pulled in. It was about 1:30 a.m. and it seemed pretty vacant. There's one other vehicle on the lot, windows steamed up. I assumed it was another road tripper who had pulled over to rub one out. We've all been there, no judgment. I get out of my car and run into the men's room. I was holding the bottom of my pants when I was running because I wasn't sure if I was gonna make it. Finally, I'm in a stall and it's not a good scene. Figuring that I would be in there for a while, I brought my smokes and a copy of Mad Magazine that I always kept in my car for emergencies like this. I was working on my 4th American Spirit when I hear another person come in. Footsteps stop. I hear him taking deep breaths. I holler out, "Hey man, I'd keep those breaths shallow." No response. I can see dude's feet right in front of my stall. They're fucking huge. Gotta be at least size 17s. Dirty as shit too. I sit in silence, staring at those huge shoes. Suddenly, ass blasts squeeze out, and the sound echoes in the empty restroom. All of a sudden, this guy starts pounding on the door, then grabbing the top and shaking it. "I'll be out in a minute, you spaz." Then it stopped. I hear footsteps again, and then a lot of squeaking. Then footsteps again, and the door opening and slamming shut. Of course, there's no toilet paper in the stall, and it was not a clean pinch, as you can imagine. I had to use my Mad Magazine. Alfred E. Newman has never been so disrespected. I exit the stall and see in the marker written on the mirror, "See you outside," and it was signed, Nitro. I'm born and bred in Maine. I've met a lot of guys who go by Nitro. Not a one do I want to meet alone at a rest stop in the middle of fucking nowhere. I was terrified. I hatch a plan that I'm gonna just go for it. I open the restroom doors and sprint to my car. Not looking back, I just ran. I hear shuffling and footsteps behind me. Urgh! I hear behind me. I left my car unlocked because it was a piece of shit, and I get right in. I get the car going and do a bit of a burnout and speed off. I see in the rearview mirror the silhouette of a massive man, throwing his hat on the ground and begin jumping up and down as I sped onto the highway. No idea what this guy's intentions were, but it was easily a top 5 scary moment for me, and I can't really bring myself to poop in a public restroom since. One day we stopped at a rest stop in Florida. I've been to this particular stop several times, and I must note that I've always picked up a creepy vibe from it. Then again, it's a rest stop. What do you expect? Anyways, I got out of the car and walked to the ladies' room. When you walk in, there were sinks on the left, stalls on the right, and straight ahead, at the end of the bathroom, was a door labeled staff only. So I went into a stall and did my business. When I stepped out, I started washing my hands. Everything was normal. Suddenly, I heard the door open, so I glanced to my right, fully expecting to see someone walking out of the stall. To my surprise, it was a man walking out of the staff-only door. I stood there for a moment, just staring at him. As he stared back, he shuffled over to the stall and walked inside, then walked out and started heading to the stall next to it. I didn't take the time to see what he was doing. I just got out of there quick. It was pretty creepy. I thought about how it could have been a misunderstanding. Maybe he thought it was empty and he had to clean. The only problem was he had no cleaning supplies, and usually a female would clean the girls' bathroom. It could have been innocent, but it did creep me out. I took in a hitchhiker that turned out to be crazy, as in legit crazy. I won't ever do that anymore, and hopefully my experience will discourage you also. I live in a foreign country, and I don't know about your country's measures against the pandemic, but at the time, we were no longer confined. It happened in September of last year. I was driving from my parents' house to a friend's apartment near our college campus. It was about an hour-and-a-half drive. We had plans to spend the week together after not seeing each other for months. Even though the incident is not related to my friend in any way, it just hit me how dangerous it actually was when I started telling them what happened. I remember one of them saying that this must have been the worst 45-minute drive of my life. I laughed at it back then, but it hits me now how true it was. I left late that day, around 9 p.m., because I remember the sun had already set and I was going to arrive late, which I didn't like. I was used to the road as I often take it. For some context, it was an hour-and-a-half drive, and I would usually stop midway in a McDonald's parking lot to smoke a cigarette before carrying on. This is important for the story. I saw a hitchhiker not long after I left my parents. I had driven about 10 to 15 minutes or so when I saw him at the exit of a roundabout. It was a tall, slender guy with one of those teeny shoulder bags guys wear across their chest. I thought it was a guy in his 20s that had just been dropped off by his friends on his way back from partying or something, which was stupid because it was still too early for a party to end. But that was the first thought I had, and I immediately felt sympathy and stopped. I rolled down the passenger window and asked where he was going. I realized right away that he was way older than I thought, at least in his 30s. He had a really pale face, and the way he looked at me honestly freaked me out. The guy was going in my direction, to town, where I would stop midway to take a break. I don't know what I was thinking, to be honest. I just responded automatically that it was on my way, and he opened the door. I had the worst 45 minutes of my life. I don't mean to be dramatic, but it was really hell. I knew right away that I had made a mistake as I drove off, because as soon as I started driving, he held his stomach tight, crouched himself in the passenger seat, going back and forth, saying he wasn't feeling good. I offered to open my window to give him some fresh air. He said he just had to take his meds, which he didn't. Saying I felt uncomfortable is an understatement. I remember thinking I had screwed up, and whatever happened, I should not stop under any circumstances. The first thing I did ask him was if he would like to be dropped off at that city's McDonald's. The parking lot was well lit, and there were usually people there until midnight, and I could also leave immediately onto a fast road. I think he agreed, but either way, it didn't matter because I wasn't planning on stopping elsewhere. I was already freaked out, though I pretended to focus on the road and tried to appear as calm as I could. He kept talking during this whole time. I don't remember in what order it happened exactly, but I remember he asked me if he could look at my nails, I had no nail polish, to which I responded I was driving. He apologized, said I shouldn't worry because he never raped anyone. He told me his girlfriend was mad at him, wanted to break up with him if he didn't come back. Asked where I was going, what I was planning to do tonight, if I was planning on having a long steaming bath, if I had a boyfriend, how we like to do it. I said that was private and I didn't want to answer. He nodded and said he used to be young too, until he got arrested. This is not a typo. Young until arrested was his words. He insisted twice that we were being followed by cars, asked me if I smoked weed. I said no, and offered me a cigarette. I said that was nice, but he didn't have to. He left the cigarette on my dashboard. He took out his phone at one point and wanted to show me a picture of him and a picture of his mom, saying she was beautiful. I took a quick glimpse, and the freaking thing was broken. Like, it had multiple straight black lines, broken pixels, and it was reddish on the left and yellowish on the right, which made the picture really creepy. He got mad at that point because I just took a quick glimpse, and he started talking louder, saying I don't give a fuck about what he's saying. I straight up said, "I'm listening, I can't watch, I'm driving." He calmed down immediately, said, "Okay, sorry," and wanted to show me another picture. He asked me if this was my car. I told him it was my parents'. Somehow I didn't want him to think that I was rich or had any kind of money. I lied, saying that I hit a deer last week and that I was trying to focus and pay attention because I didn't want to break my parents' car. I had hoped he would shut up. He didn't. At some point, he was just straight up staring at me, and he muttered, "Poor thing." He then straightened up and pointed at a road sign in a panic, saying, "I meant the road sign. Poor road sign." Honestly, I think at that point, I was thinking if he ever tried anything, I would crash the car into a tree, because if I could not make it out, neither would he. I'm ashamed to say this, but I didn't get him out of my car that easily. He screamed that his name was Archangel Michael. He asked my name. I gave him a fake one, said something like, "Michael, right?" And he crashed himself again in panic, going back and forth, saying that I shouldn't know his name. I just said, "Okay." To be honest, that's the only thing I could say in the end. When we came into the city where he had to stop, he asked me if I could take him to the train station. It was almost 10 p.m., and I knew that there was no trains, no lights, and surely no other cars or human presence. I told him we had said that we would stop at McDonald's. He nodded, yes. He said I was nice, put a coin on the dashboard next to the cigarette. I stopped in the parking lot, but did not park. I just stopped right there in the middle of the way where I felt the most exposed. He just left saying, "See you later." And I drove away very fast. Never saw or heard from him again. I hope you'll never take a hitchhiker in. I know I won't ever again. I was a pretty brave person when I was younger. Or maybe I just had the sense of invincibility that comes with youth. I survived things like a stalker who pursued my sister and I for over a year and a half, being sexually assaulted, 2 house fires, and growing up in a house that I swear to you was haunted. Not in that Disney way either. I'm talking torture chamber in the basement and strange things going on. Anyway, I suppose looking back, that having been through all of that made me feel a little like either I was some sort of invincible, or maybe I just assumed that I had gotten all the bad stuff out of the way and nothing else would happen. Whatever it was, I learned to know better. When I was 17, I didn't have a driver's license. I walked most places, occasionally catching rides with friends, and less occasionally, hitchhiking. The night in question was one of those seldom seen occasions where I decided to hitchhike. I had worked late and was too exhausted to walk. Now, most of the time when I did hitchhike, I wouldn't get in a car with a lone man, only woman, or rarely a man with his wife or girlfriend and or kids in the car. That night, though, cars were few and far between and it was cold. And really, if I'm being frank, When he pulled over, I took a good look and figured I could take him if he tried anything. He was on the slender side and had a strange frailness about him, even though he looked healthy enough. I got into his car after we agreed on the destination. We exchanged names, and I warmed my fingers in front of the heating vent. He spoke quietly, asking me a few questions along the lines of if I was local and how I liked living there. He said that he had only been there for a couple months, but found it beautiful and hoped he could find happiness there. That comment struck me as a little odd, but I brushed it off. It began to snow and the road quickly got slippery, so he slowed down and kept his eyes straight out the windshield, driving silently. I was okay with that, as small talk was never my forte. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car near the intersection we were approaching seemed to be sliding, so I said, "Watch out." He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection, and burst out with, "Don't ever scream at me." Needless to say, I was taken aback. I said, "Look, this is close enough. Just pull over here and I can get out." He didn't seem to hear me. Richard, did you hear me? I said you can pull over right here and let me out." No response. He just stared straight ahead, driving faster now than he had been since it began to snow. To say I was scared doesn't seem to cover the depth of fear that began to arise in me. I didn't know if I should stay quietly or speak, but I was damn sure not going to yell after his outburst. After about a mile, he began to mumble something under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I assumed that he was speaking to me, so I said, "What? I can't hear you." He began to speak quietly and rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I told you time and time again I don't appreciate being yelled at, but do you listen? No. Well, I'm done listening to you now. Do you hear that?" I was completely lost. I didn't know what to say in response, or if I should say anything at all. I contemplated just jumping out of the car, but nixed that idea when I realized that the door lock was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. I started to cry and debate with myself about causing an accident by grabbing the wheel and hoping for the best. At least, I figured there was a chance I would survive that. He suddenly looked at me for the first time since I had gotten in the car. He blinked several times, rapidly, then slowed the car down, pulling into a gas station. I waited to see if he would unlock the doors, not wanting to say anything to set him off again. After a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I better let you out here." He hit the button to unlock the doors. I wasn't about to hesitate. I jumped out of the car as if it were on fire. I was about to turn and walk into the gas station when he called out my name. He looked so damn sad. I hesitated. He apologized, said that he was sorry that he frightened me, and that he would never have harmed me. Asked if I would be able to get home okay. I said I would and closed the door. He began to pull out of the gas station, but stopped suddenly. He just sat there for a couple moments, his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell he was up to, and was about to run into the station. At that moment, he opened his window and yelled at me, waved something in his hand. My hat. I had left it on the seat. I warily approached his side of the car, and he handed it to me, apologizing again. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said, "Thanks." I watched him drive off, making sure he was out of sight before moving on, so he wouldn't know which direction I was heading to. I decided to go to a friend's house instead of home. As I walked, I went to put my hat back on. A piece of paper fell out. Folded in the paper was a $100 bill. The paper said, "I'm sorry, please take a cab and don't hitchhike anymore tonight." I didn't. In fact, it was the last time I ever hitchhiked a ride alone. My friend and I decided to drive to Philadelphia to Miami Beach. The car block cracked in North Carolina. This was around 1975. I thought it would be an adventure to hitchhike the rest of the way. I remember waiting all night on a godforsaken stretch of highway in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We got a ride from some guy with a Prince Valiant haircut, who upon dropping us off said, I'll probably see you guys in the morning on my way to work. 9 hours later, sure enough, he picked us up in a station wagon filled with vending machine sandwiches. We finally got to the area around the border with South Carolina. That's when the guy, spitting an image of Bundy in retrospect, stopped and asked us where we were going. When I said Miami, he said, "What street?" We were overjoyed that this young guy, older than us, was going to take us straight to my mother's house in Bay Harbor. Now, I cannot prove that this was Ted Bundy, but what happened was creepy, and I have researched a little and found that this happened at the time after Bundy's prison break in Colorado, and at the same time he supposedly moved to Florida. Anyway, after we got in the car, he offered us a joint. He said he didn't want any, but told us that we could toke up. Well, whatever was in that joint was powerful enough to almost paralyze us both. He then began to start playing with the buttons on the radio, switching stations compulsively, almost every few seconds. I began to feel paranoid because I could sense some weirdness exuding from this guy. I was in the front seat and my friend in the back. We went to a rest stop and he disappeared into a bathroom for about an hour. When he finally got back to the car, he said he had to take a detour to his bank and started to take us miles through some small roads in Georgia. I remember seeing houses on stilts in marshland. He finally stopped in the most remote location where there was a single building that looked like an abandoned tavern. We were still stoned. He got out of the car and went behind the building. I just remember seeing palm trees and was shocked that palm trees were this far north in Georgia. He got back in the car and had these sunglasses on. I noticed that he seemed short as he walked back to the car. He said he now had to speak with his lawyer and began talking about real estate law and the changes in the law that would allow development in this area. We then drive hours and hours until we get to Jacksonville. He pulled the car over in a strip mall-like area and told us that there was a change of plans. We had to get out there. We were exhausted and hungover from angel dust or whatever was in that joint. We saw a bus station and took the rest of the way to Miami. As I think back, I'm almost certain this was Ted Bundy. I still see his face, and the time frame and location were right. We were two men, so I don't think that we were in danger, unless Bundy was considering killing men. I think he was just enjoying mind-fucking us, and that is my story. Some backstory. My dad lives near a woodland tract that is perfect for dog walking, and during COVID he got a dog, which I have not had too much interactions with due to the nearly 2 years of restrictions. The dog can be anxious and worried when she can't find someone she recognizes, so we decided the best way to get her comfortable with me would be to take her for walks along the track. I would let her off the lead, and if she wandered too far, call her name to get her back. It was towards the end of this walk that things started getting creepy very quickly. It's starting to get dark and we are nearing the end of the track and the beginning of the main road back home. I call the dog back and put her on her lead. All is fine till she is back by my side. Just as I'm leaning down to put her lead on, I hear a noise in the woods. My dad's dog hears it too and nearly sprints after it. I manage to get her on the lead in time and look towards the noise. Then I hear it again, a voice calling my dog's name just as I've been all walk. And I don't just mean saying the same name, I mean trying its hardest to copy my voice. I felt like I completely froze in place. I didn't want to turn my head from the woods in case whoever it was would come running out at me. I was praying I was just hearing things. Then, just like the time before, but this time from a spot closer to us, the voice called for my dog. It was at this point that I grabbed my dog and ran. While this was only a very brief encounter, it's still one of the most terrifying situations I've ever been in. Earlier tonight, I was on my way through Mississippi on Interstate 55. I pulled over at a rest stop just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, because I needed to pee. This time, I had something unusually scary happen. This was around 11:30, so the rest stop was mostly dead aside from truckers pulled into spots sleeping. I've stopped at this one before because it's pretty well lit and has security, which anyone familiar with Memphis knows is a blessing. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, 6'1", 180, yada yada, so I'm not usually intimidated by places like that, but tonight was different. I walked into the bathrooms and things seemed normal, but the handicap stall at the end was closed, which I didn't think too much of at the time. However, after I walked up to the urinal, I started getting a weird feeling in my gut. Kind of like when it's dark outside and you can't really decide if a tree is just a tree or something else, you know? I brushed it off and unzipped to get my business done so I can get back on the road. As I'm standing there, I hear shoes move. That sinking feeling turned into alarm bells almost immediately. I heard the stall door unlock and someone start running. Now, this isn't a big bathroom, so I panic. I turn on my heels as I'm standing and book it for the door as I hear someone behind me running. I didn't stop or turn my head to look or anything. I just ran. I made it back to my car, but didn't see anyone come out of the bathroom while I cranked it and didn't hang around to see if anything else would happen. It may not sound like much, but this was one of the few times I actually felt some deep urge to get the hell out of there. So whoever it was who caught me, quite literally, with my cock out, I hope he slipped on my piss. When we were teenagers, my friends and I would go out and explore, do dumb things, basically just be kids. We have a lot of odd experiences and stories that I plan to tell, but this is just one of them. So during the summer when I was 17, me and 3 friends decided to go on a camping trip. I'll call these friends Tia, Jean, and Aria. We didn't want to go to an established campground because we weren't trying to spend a bunch of money, and we just like creepiness overall. Aria lived near woods anyway, so we decided to go deep into those and camp there. We wanted to go for a weekend. A fun thing that we did splurge on was a huge tent that could easily fit 4 of us, and probably another person if we tried. Now, the first night was fun and simple. We did the typical roasting marshmallows and told some stories, not exclusively spooky ones, but past experiences too. Tia was the first to turn in, and she did so early because she had been working the night before. Nobody had a problem with it. A few hours later, like 2 a.m., it was only Jean and Aria left awake. I had gone to bed second, but I woke up with Tia shaking me awake and looking distressed. She said something along the lines of hearing jostling outside the tent, but further behind it, not where Aria or Jean would have been. She didn't suspect anything malicious, so immediately thought it was a bear. This part of the story is a little lost on me as I was half asleep, so I'll just tell it how my friend did. I peeked out of the tent to investigate, as if that would help. The noise was supposedly behind us, and I saw Jean and Aria frozen, scared. They were looking behind the tent. Aria noticed my groggy head emerging from the tent, and she shook her head and put her finger over her mouth, telling me to be quiet. Aria whispered something to Jean, and they both ran into the tent, shaken. This is where I start to wake up a little more. Tia explains her side of the story to them, and they say that they saw a woman in the distance looking at them, but trying not to be seen. Apparently, once she noticed that they had saw her, she took off in the other direction. All of us being scared now, we decided to sleep in shifts. This worked up until Aria's turn, and she passed out. The next morning, when we all stepped out, we decided to look around as a group. We saw nothing out of the ordinary. Being spooked, we all agreed that we didn't want to camp out there anymore, so we decided to just spend the rest of the weekend at Aria's. But as we were emerging from the woods, we saw a middle-aged woman with blonde hair walking down the road. She caught a glimpse of us and quickly turned her head away and started walking faster. We just looked at each other. I think it was me who asked if that's what the woman looked like. Aria and Jean said they couldn't really see the features in the dark, but she was about that height. I just wonder if she had malicious intent, or what her point of view was. Either way, I only ever camp in established grounds now. I'm a 17-year-old female. I am a pro non-competitive mountain bike rider, and was competing in a 24-hour race in my hometown. It's in a wide canyon and truly lasts 24 hours, so I had my tent packed under my bike, plenty of snacks, water, sleeping bag, and of course my bike. So I'm a non-competitive member of my team. I spend my time taking laps, fundraising for cancer research, and enjoying my time in the race. To the story. I was preparing to stop for the night and unpack my tent on this extended trail near the river. It's maybe 50 feet near a cliff, and it's one of my favorite spots on this trail. I had 3 other teammates behind me who were gradually going to meet up with me. We had lapped different times, so they began later than me. I was busy pitching my tent, getting my food out, ready for my other members to meet up with me when I heard rushing behind me and assumed it was a cyclist coming in fast. I knew there were other cyclists who weren't yet settled in for the night and probably still riding the time trial laps, so I didn't think anything of it. I turned around and nothing. The cyclist would have passed me if it had been going that fast, so I shrugged it off and assumed that there was maybe a cyclist on another path that I heard. Again, 5 minutes later, another whoosh, but instead of a cyclist, a random man came walking out of the brush near my campsite. Not in a jersey, no cyclist bib, nothing, so I knew he wasn't a cyclist. He was in shorts, a t-shirt, with sandals. My first thought was, a hiker? But this location was closed down for the competition. Only cyclists were allowed near here, and plus, why would a hiker be here at 10 p.m. in the pitch black darkness? The man just looks at me for what seems like forever. To say I was afraid to break eye contact was an understatement. We continued to lock eyes until we heard gears of upcoming bike riders, who I later found out were my other riders. Right as my teammates meet up, the man just disappears again, back into the darkness. We didn't see him again. Thankfully, we slept great, but during dinner you can assume we had some crazy stories. Apparently, my other 17-year-old teammate has said that she has seen eyes or some glowing dots in the trees when they passed. They were wearing headlamps, and we have lights on our cycles. The others agreed and said that there was something more than the usual coyotes out there. Overall, fun weekend, and the competition was amazing, but it was a terrifying moment for me and my mates. Edit. Something else that happened that I forgot to mention. After that night, we went to meet back up at the main time stop places. We heard that other riders had experienced the same thing. Glowing eyes, people randomly appearing, hikers being out way later than the trails were supposed to. Someone even mentioned it seemed one person had a gun. Creepy. In the summer of 2019, my partner and I, both early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and stay at the Golden Ears Provincial Park. We liked camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different than we did on most of our other vacations. My partner has never been outside the United States, and it seemed like a crazy new experience. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite in Golden Ears, and it was close to winter. We'd packed terribly, had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruit and veggies to eat healthy, stored them in a cooler that was too small, and brought a cutting board with a knife to break up their snacks while driving. We started in California, switching off driving our red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington, and we made it to Vancouver. We spent a day or two in each state, drank a little too much, and stayed out late. Canada was the best part, and Illilouette Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks, with our toes freezing in the cold lake. We hiked around, saw a beautiful waterfall. We saw other couples taking pictures there for an hour, and we started modeling the same poses from far away. Everything was perfect. The campsite was empty, except for another couple. We went to bed early that night. It was quiet, and I woke up to crackling outside our tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black and probably an animal. Then the crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on, and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with the light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right next to the tent. I sat up and froze. They weren't moving, and they were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. They woke up, and I said that there's someone outside our tent. Then I hear footsteps, quiet footsteps, walking out of our campsite. My partner starts loudly saying, "What?" repeatedly in a sleepy haze. A car or truck is parked right outside our camp area, and it starts to drive off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned a corner and were out of view, so I couldn't make out much, but it looked like a truck. Now I'm shaking, and my partner can't put together what's happening. I want to leave, but Golden Ears locks their gate until 6 or 7 in the morning, and it was only 1, so we're gonna be here. I make us move to the Ford Fiesta and sleep in the tightly packed car. She falls asleep immediately and thinks I'm just being paranoid. It could have been a park ranger, but it seems too weird of behavior for a park ranger. I sit in there wide awake for 2 hours. The car is locked and I want to sleep but can't. I'm in the passenger seat, my partner is in the driver's seat asleep, and it's 3 a.m. I'm still half awake. I hear a car slowly driving up the road, lights off, as it rounds the corner. It had to be the same truck. I was scared, but my adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounds the corner and pulls directly in front of our campsite again, in the same spot. I feel like I'm gonna throw up. I had no weapon other than a kitchen knife we had brought for our fruit and vegetables. So I grabbed the knife and tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sit up in the passenger seat, holding the kitchen knife. I keep it straightened up at eye level and stare deadpan at the truck in the pitch black. The truck stops and turns off. A light directly shining into my face is coming from the truck, and I stare back terrified in my Ford Fiesta, holding the large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck starts up again and turns on its lights, and they stay on, blinding me. Then the truck pulls out and turns around to go back where they came from. My heart is pounding, and I wake up my partner and say that we need to get the hell out. We pack by just throwing things into the car and sit there awake until 6 a.m. We drove home and don't stop. We keep rehashing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decide that we both needed some sleep. This happened to a group of friends and I on a camping expedition for an award program. It was the second day, and we were coming to the end of our 6-hour walk. We were walking across a small country road. The nearest house was pretty far behind us and way out of earshot. At the end of this country road was a bridle path that ran perpendicular, probably about 2 miles from the nearby village. As we were approaching this path, an unmarked white van came up the road, but instead of stopping, he pulled up right in front of us. The width of the van was about that of the country road, so we couldn't get past. He rolled down his window and started asking us questions. It wasn't uncommon for locals to ask us questions or give us words of encouragement, but this guy just didn't sit right with me. Being an all-female group, and not to mention, all of us were incredibly exhausted, this was a concern of mine. I brushed it off since it didn't seem to worry anyone else. I figured I just watched too many true crime documentaries. He asked us what we were doing, as many people had, and we explained the award program we were on. His questions began relatively normal and small talkish, but they began to get more specific. "So you're camping out tonight then?" We replied and said that we were, ready for him to drive off so we could continue our route. "Where's your campsite?" This sent shivers down my spine. This may have not been anything sinister, but that was none of his business. I feigned ignorance, as if I didn't know where our campsite was, and gestured vaguely in the opposite direction of the site. Again, I was just expecting him to shrug this off and go about his day, but no. "Surely you must know where your campsite is." This is when one of my friends blurted out the name of our campsite. I froze for a second, but luckily he didn't hear this. He began to ask questions like, "Is it near? Is it that way? What does it look like?" This was far too specific for my liking, so I maintained that I had no idea. Eventually, he began to drive away, looking strangely disappointed without saying anything. We waited until he was a ways down the road before we continued walking, a little shaken. We made it back to our campsite and reported it to the counselor. I didn't get any sleep that night. Maybe I was overreacting. but I dread to think what could have happened. This happened last April. There is a river that runs through my town that everyone likes to hang out on the rocks and the beaches during the warmer months. I, female, 26, went to a more secluded spot, but it's always my go-to. It was completely empty, but luckily, there were a group of girls just on the other side of the beach. So I'm laying there on my stomach with one of my headphones in. I look up and suddenly see a very creepy looking man standing right next to me, less than a foot away. He stared directly at me, and when he sees me notice him, he looks at the group of girls who are watching, and he began to walk away to the path at the top of the beach. I'm terrified at this point and don't let him out of my sight. He stops. On the path, there are some very light bushes between us, and he's whipping out his dick, and what I presume begins to pee while making direct eye contact with me. At this point, I did not want to see his dick, so I looked away and called a friend. I noticed a group of girls looking my way, and when I look back, the guy is gone. I'm scared as heck about what just happened, and the girl hollered at me to see if I was okay. She actually came up to me before she left and asked if I had a friend coming to get me, and gave me her pepper spray. The beach spot requires you to cross the train tracks and walk through paths in the woods. It's easy to get to, but usually visited by people around my age or a little older. He's definitely not a river goer and was very stereotypical creepy. My partner, 22 female, was at a bachelor party at a campground. I was not involved for reasons of being a male. The audacity, I know, but I stayed up late just in case anything happened. She calls me at 12 a.m. panicking, saying, "He was just here," and I had to recount everything after taking a few breaths. So this is her story, not mine, but I was very much involved. After a fun night of drinking, playing video games, hiking, swimming, and deciding to call it a night, we will call my partner Mindy. Mindy decided to finally take a shower after everyone else was turning in, and walked up to the camp bathrooms. She noticed an older white male sitting on the bench, but he doesn't pay her any mind, listening to something on his phone. She assumed that he was waiting for someone, or was just sitting at the bench at night. Campgrounds are full of strange bench sitters. It's one of these time showers where you push a button to get the water to go, so her shower is very short. She had brought her clothes in, so she got dressed. She heard someone else and assumed that another person needed to use the shower. As she opened the curtain, she sees a man peeking into the shower stalls one at a time. She was the only person in there, and all she could do was stand there, mouth agape, staring at the man. He realized someone was standing there, and when he saw her, his eyes got super wide and he sprinted away. I told her that the ranger or camp staff should be nearby and to let them know immediately, or to call the police. But since she was at someone's celebration, she didn't want to disturb anything. I figured that there was some shock and didn't want to raise her anxiety by arguing. Still, neither of us slept that night as I waited for her calls, and she waited for the man to break into her tent. She told the ranger the next morning, and they said, "We got several reports yesterday about this man, but no one could seem to find him." Flabbergasted that the man had once again caused discomfort. It seems to me that he was trying to muster up the courage to potentially do something worse, and it was a whole day of stalking, hiding, waiting, and sneaking into shower stalls, but that he was still timid. I'm just glad she came home safely, and I really wish I was there because I'm the guy that runs tourist explosions. Literally happened once. It was a cold October night, around 11 p.m. when my buddy and I were cruising and stopped to take a smoke break. We got out of the car in a secluded area in a small village. The place we walked to was next to a dark, running biking track which entered a forest. We sat down on a bench outside the tree line, smoking our special cigarettes under the subtle light of the moon. A remarkable thing about this spot was that it was located in view of the House of Morsall. In 1996, 3 people were brutally murdered in there, and it has been since sealed up. It is known that the interior is untouched since that crime. A documentary was made about this. that's how I know this info. Here's the other thing I know. The 2 murderers are already released from jail, and by the time of the incident, one of them was let go from prison just months before. Back to the bench. After about 10 to 15 minutes, our eyes were able to see better in the dark, and I started looking towards the dark running path that led into the forest. Between the trees, I saw something which I thought was a bag or a mask, or a rope hanging from a branch at eye height. I immediately told my friend and he agreed about the conclusion, but after moving a few steps closer and focusing our eyesight, we saw that it was a grown man with a bag or mask on his head, in the fucking dark. He was standing in some bushes, and we saw the movement of his breathing, and that he was wearing regular boomer clothes. First, we quietly told each other, "What the fuck?" and confirmed that we both saw exactly the same thing. Reminder that this person was standing about 10 meters away from us, and we were there for about 10 to 15 minutes in the pitch darkness. Then we are looking at him, and another minute until I start yelling at him. I just yelled things like, "Hey, come out!" I did this despite being spooked by the strange experience. It's how I am. He raised his hand in a motion of aiming a gun, and we ran back to the car as fast as we could. Looking over our shoulders, we saw that he kept his arm located to us, but couldn't make out if he had an actual gun. After getting the fuck out of there and recollecting, we did realize one more disturbing thing. The guy did not want to mess with 2 young adult males. In the daylight, a lot of people traverse this place by bike or foot, so one of the possibilities is that this crazy man was gonna intercept a lone person in the wrong place at the wrong time. This occurred around 1999-2000. My best friend and I were avid outdoor adventurers and amateur pot growers. We would frequently find secluded places in the woods that allowed for ample light and shade for the plants to grow, and that would not allow them to be found easily. One particular day we went to an annex of trails located near a New Jersey State Park trail system. The trails weren't in the park, but I had hiked them before and knew they weren't that frequented. We had gone out that day with our seeds partially sprouted in moist paper towels. We parked the car on the trailhead and started to hike in. We covered a mile or so, and then we ventured off a trail into the woods. We found a clearing, planted the seeds, and tied a few barely visible ribbons off to mark the way to spot our plants, to check on them in the future. My friend and I got back on the trail and started walking back to the car, when my friend noticed a man in the other direction just staring at us. He was probably in his 30s or 40s, bald head, normal clothes. We didn't think much of it for the most part, but we definitely kept looking back as anyone would have with someone behind them in the woods. We saw he was walking 60 or so feet behind us. It seemed weird, but it was probably more so due to us having anxiety since we planted the seeds. We picked up the pace, but the man seemed to pick up his pace as we weren't gaining any distance. At one point, we just decided to get off the trail and let him pass. We turned off the trail and walked into the thicket of sticker bushes, which I remember vividly getting shredded on. We got deeper into the woods and heard cursing. When we turned around, the man was coming through where we entered. It was at that moment that we actually became scared. Mind you, we were 2 young, strong 19-year-olds, but a man following you into the woods is damn creepy. We kinda made a U maneuver and outflanked him and came out of the woods a bit further down the trail. Once on the trail, we ran. As we were running, there was a fork in the trail and my best friend went right and I went left. I realized my mistake as my buddy was going down the correct path and I wasn't. So I turned around and started running back towards the fork to follow my friend. As I was running towards the direction we came from to get to the fork, I could see the man running towards me down the trail. He was a distance away, but not far enough in my eyes. Survival mode kicked in and I ran as hard as I could. I caught up with my friend who was walking at that point. I screamed that he's after us and we both booked it all the way to the car. We got into the car shaking and out of breath. We backed up and started to get out of the parking lot when the man appeared at the trailhead. I always wondered what that was all about. Did he want to kill a couple of 19-year-olds? Was he also doing some illegal things in the woods and wanted us gone? My buddy and I still laugh and talk about that day 22 years later. I'm so glad I found this subreddit because I love remembering this story. It's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. Also, this was in 9th grade. There was this huge state park right outside of the town I lived in. My friend and I would go down the trails every now and then. We had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when we realized there was an older woman not far behind us. I only really noticed because of how out of place she looked, like she came straight out of an old folks' home and just was dropped into the woods. We were joking around about how creepy she was and sped up to put some distance between us, but every time we did, we'd look back and still be able to spot her. We did this probably 3 times. We still thought it was funny though. We ended up running down the trail until we got to a small bridge. We hopped off the bridge into the creek and then went around the bend. We could still see the bridge from where we were. We were cracking up the whole time when we saw the old lady again. We had run for a good couple minutes, like she shouldn't have caught up to us that fast, and it was like she had gotten off the trail because she was standing on the bridge looking around. I think that's when we stopped thinking it was funny. As soon as she left, we took off running the other way. That was it though, nothing happened. I just always thought the whole thing was creepy. A few months ago, my girlfriend and I were on a drive back home from a late night concert about 1 a.m. We were basically in the middle of nowhere, and I decided to pull off at a random rest stop to use the bathroom. I figured at this time the only people at this place would be either truckers and other people in the same situation as me. I got out of my car and walked up to the building, and as soon as I stepped inside, there was a few weird things that I noticed. So this place is laid out with 2 men's rooms and 2 women's rooms, 2 vending machines, one in both corners on either side of the restroom doors. When I walk in, there were 2 people, both of them standing directly in front of each of the vending machines. Both just staring at the vending machines, not reaching to get money or actually intending to buy something. So I walked past these people and went into the first restroom. I walked inside and I was the only person in the restroom, using the urinals, which is laid out in a U shape. A few seconds later, someone else walks in, an older guy, maybe 50 or 60, working class looking guy. He walked over and started using the urinal right behind me, about a few feet away. Nothing about this was very alarming at first, but being a careful person that I am, I already have my pocket knife open in my hand, in my front hoodie pocket. Once I finish up, I go to wash my hands and walk out the door to the first restroom. As I walked out, I realized I also had to take a shit, so to avoid being awkward, I walk into the second men's restroom, taking a note that these weird vending machine people were in the same exact spot. I go into the first stall and try to go about my business when I hear someone else walk into the restroom and go into the stall right beside me. Keep in mind, there are about 6 open stalls away from mine. I thought that was very weird, so I looked down and immediately recognized the work boots as the guy in the first bathroom. This guy just walked in and I wasn't even in there for 2 minutes. I immediately got up and left the bathroom. I started to speed walk out the building, and I noticed from outside, looking back inside, he also quickly got up and was heading towards the outside doors. I hopped in my car, waking up my girlfriend, and told her I would explain in a minute. I put the car into reverse and whipped out of the spot. As I was shifting into drive, I looked up and saw this guy only a few feet away, standing next to his old beat-down truck, literally staring me down as I started to drive away. I stared directly back at him and saw him make a really creepy, mime-like surprised look at me. I was really tired and confused, but I still don't know what this guy was planning at the rest stop in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m., or if the vending machine people had anything to do with it at all. This is one of the only times I've experienced something like this, and have felt actual danger. If anyone has any similar experiences or ideas of what this may have been, I would love to hear it. I'll preface this by saying that we were 12 or 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late night walks. This was the basis for this terrifying encounter, and it stopped us from sneaking out after dark again. My friend lived opposite of a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out of, and us to roam the night, because the forest was more scary and thrilling. We always took flashlights, food, and blankets, so we could camp out for a couple hours before going back home. Well, on this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake, so my friend suddenly jolted me awake from sleep. It was past 3 a.m., a lot later than we usually snuck out at. We grabbed our essentials and crept out the back door into the cold, dark night. Frost crunched underfoot as we crossed the deserted road and we reached the entrance to the forest. We noticed how pitch black and completely silent it was, unnervingly so. We turned on our flashlights and stepped onto the uneven path into the forest. The light illuminating the trees, swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen leaves and bark as we made our unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of the forest. Our cold breath was the only noise to invade the deafening silence. We reached a small hut we constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, purely for the purpose of having shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part it stayed intact. On this occasion it was completely destroyed, a sign of worse to come. We were just deciding to call it a night and come back later in the day to repair the hut when we heard it. This loud shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped up in shock and looked at each other like, what the fuck? We were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my entire body break out in goosebumps. Someone is in here, my friend whispered at me, looking utterly terrified. We gotta go now. Her voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving that someone was in the forest with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. We just looked at each other and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory. Our uneven gasps of air punctuating the giggle that seemed to be following us, getting closer and closer. Our flashlights went up and down with the fast movements, illuminating random patches of trees and bushes as we finally saw a small sliver of light as we came through the forest entrance. Running out of the forest, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes went wide and she nudged me, pointing a shaking finger across the road. A haggard woman, middle-aged, was standing at the forest entrance, giggling, the awful, horrifying giggle, and was waving over at us. We screamed and ran inside and looked out from my friend's bedroom window through the smallest gap in the curtain and could still see the woman standing there. Worse yet, she was staring right at us as if she knew we were there. We could tell she was giggling a hideous, appalling laugh. She turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. We never went back to that forest, nor did we go out after dark again. I was about 30 years old and my girlfriend and I decided to go camping for a couple nights in a spot that she knew of in British Columbia. It wasn't any sort of official campground or anything, but it was a spot that you could pull over and park on the side of the highway to get into it. So we did, and then we trekked in with our gear into the woods that were between the highway and the waterway. After about 20 minutes of walking along a well-used trail, we got to an area where there were a few old foundations from abandoned buildings, including at least one with an intact set of concrete stairs. This spot also opened up into a nice little beach on the ocean and had a nice space to set up the tent beside the trail that we had been walking along. So within a half hour the tent was set up, a fire was prepared, and we had chopped up enough wood for the night. I decided to have a look at how much further the trail went. My girlfriend took her journal down to the beach to write. I wasn't gone very long, as within a few hundred yards the trail came to an abrupt end at the base of a cliff. It was maybe 40 to 50 feet high and ran out into the water in one direction and out of eyesight in the other. I did try to follow it inland, but the forest became quite dense very quickly, so I had to stop within 30 minutes of exploring. I headed back to our camp and headed down to the beach. My girlfriend and I spent the rest of the afternoon there, and around 6 p.m. we went back to our site. I started up the fire, we cooked some dinner, and had some wine. So far, this was a very nice little getaway. After tidying up everything and letting the fire die down, we got ready for bed and slipped into the tent to sleep. For whatever reason, I grabbed the axe from the stump that I had used to split the firewood earlier and brought it into the tent. Not something I normally did previously when camping, maybe because of the unofficial nature of this campsite. As is usually the case when camping, I fell asleep almost immediately. The exercise and fresh air do that to me every time. While asleep, a storm system had rolled in and it started to rain heavily. Being the good Cub Scout I was, I had taken the time to spread the tarp over the tent so none of the rain was hitting our tent and much of the wind was blocked as well. We were nice and snug, but the storm was making some very loud sounds which made it hard for me to fall back asleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning I was pulled out of a light sleep by what sounded like footsteps coming down the trail. By this time of night, the storm had mostly passed and the only other sound was light rain hitting the tarp. I half sat up and through the tent material I could see a light coming down the trail, matching these footsteps. That got my attention really quickly. Who the fuck would be out here in the middle of the night, along a trail that is well off the beaten track and ends about a football field or so past where we are? Suddenly the light and the footsteps stop moving and the light goes out. What the fuck? Now it's one thing to be out here walking along in the middle of the night, but why would you feel the need to turn off your flashlight? The footsteps resumed towards us, but now at a slower speed and softer. I reached over and grabbed the axe. Quietly I took the cover off of it and slightly nudged my girlfriend. Don't say anything, but someone's approaching the campsite on the trail. She gave me a quizzical look, and I just shrugged my shoulders and nodded in the direction that the person was coming from. Almost immediately she picked up on the sound of the footsteps, which were both closer and slower. We looked at each other with freaked out expressions. I showed her the axe and she looked relieved. The footsteps had stopped very close to our tent. For about 5 to 10 minutes there was no movement from outside, although we could hear whoever this was breathing. Finally I called out and said, "Hey, whoever's out there, do you need any help?" Once I said that, the flashlight turned back on and was shined against our tent a few times and around our campsite a few more. Abruptly, the person began to walk down the trail again in the direction of the cliff. Very quickly they were out of sight down the trail, so I took the opportunity to get my jeans and boots on in case there was some sort of further weirdness when they came back, since there was nowhere for them to go once they got to the cliff. After about 20 minutes of waiting, they still hadn't returned. So I got out of the tent and started a fire. My girlfriend got dressed and came out to join me. After another 20 to 30 minutes, we made some coffee and sat there, keeping warm by the fire. We sat there till the sun came up. No one ever came back down the trail. Once it was fully bright, I took the axe and made my way along the path until I got to the cliff. No sign of last night's visitor to be seen. I slowly made my way back to the campsite, looking carefully to each side to see if there was any trails I missed. We packed up immediately and left. To this day I have no idea who this person was, where they came from, or where they disappeared to. Needless to say, I never went back to camp there again. "10 years ago, my wife and I planned a hike at Mount St. Helens on Mother's Day. It was the last weekend to hike to the summit without permits. The mountain is still covered with snow at that time of the year typically, so the tradition is that everyone hikes up the mountain wearing a skirt, which actually made climbing easier. And once you reach the summit, most people either ski or sled down the mountain. We were offered a chance to play some music the night before in Seattle, so we were late getting started in the morning. In fact, we were the last ones to start up the mountain. Well, it was a beautiful sunny day and pretty warm. We struggled to reach the summit because the snow had melted so fast that even snowshoes barely kept us from sinking and sliding. We knew that the daylight was going to be running out soon and quickly started sledding down the mountain. We were by far the last people on the mountain. There really isn't much signage, but we knew where we needed to be. Right before the tree line is the turnoff that is crucial and easy to miss in the snow, especially if someone is skiing or sledding. We picked up our sleds and start the final hike to the car through the woods. Just then my wife's cell phone beeped after finding a signal, and we laughed that she had left it on the entire hike. We continued on until we ran into a couple hiking back up the hill. Very unusual. They stopped and asked if we were the last hikers on the mountain, and we said yes. The woman started crying and told us they had reached the summit and her mother wanted to ski down ahead and would meet them at the car. When they got to the car, her mother wasn't there. They couldn't reach her by phone, so they were climbing back up to find her as it was getting dark. We told them that we had just gotten a signal on my wife's phone, and before they continued, to please call their friends waiting at the car. They called. Their mother was still missing. We were all scared at this point. As we were talking on the phone, their friends said they saw a car and her mother got out. Everyone rejoiced. So the mother skied down the hill, missed a turnoff, and ended up 8 miles down on a snow-covered road that was rarely used. Someone was on the road and gave her a lift to the car. If we had ended the call earlier, they would have continued up the mountain and would have likely been lost. About 2 years ago, me and my family moved from New Jersey to Florida for a fresh start. Before I start my encounter, I want to iterate my mental state at the time, because it contributes to how I acted at the time of the story. So the night of the move, my mother had just got a call from a close family friend. She had just become pregnant and had started to have complications, and feared she had lost a baby. My mother, being the awesome woman she is, went over to help and watched her young son, can't remember his age at the time, and calmed my friend down, and told her to go to the hospital to be sure and get it checked out. She and her husband rushed to the hospital, and luckily she hadn't lost a baby. But it wasn't until 1 in the morning until my mother got back, and I was still up waiting for her to get back. So yes, we were dead tired the next day when we packed up everything for the long trip to our new home in Florida. While my father, who had slept through the whole ordeal the night before, was not. But that's just me bitching. Anyway, I'm driving with my mother while my father is in another car, and I'm not exactly happy about the move. So tired and upset, we continued with our trip. We'd always driven from New Jersey to Florida for years and never had any really weird experiences out on the road. I'm not sure about my parents, but they never talked to me about anything creepy in my 22 years I had been alive and had traveled with them. And trust me, they love to tell me stories, and I do too. So when this happened, I was totally unprepared for it. What happened the night before certainly didn't help. So we stopped at one of the many stops on our way to Florida, and I think we were in the Carolinas or somewhere near there when we stopped. Now, if you ever traveled by car, a rest stop is a place kind of like a civic center rest area. These places are for travelers who either needed a minute to stretch, go to the bathroom, or a place where they can safely rest for the night in their cars. These places are usually well lit and have vending machines for anyone who needs a snack or drink. It was late, maybe 9 or 10 at night, and we stopped to stretch our legs and go to the bathroom. I wanted a few snacks, so I asked my mother for a few bucks. She gave them to me, and I entered the little enclosed area that contained these machines. So I'm standing there, alone, picking what I wanted when this woman comes in. She's a short, skinny older woman who dressed nice with bleached blonde hair. When I glanced at her and smiled politely, she came right up to me and held her hand out to shake and introduce herself. Dumbfounded, I shake her hand back and stupidly told her my name. After that, she launches into this tale about how she lost her wedding ring, had a head wound, and her car was out of gas, and she needed some money and other things that I honestly can't remember. I'm just standing there listening and trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation. Now you have to understand, this was literally the first time anyone has ever approached me at one of these stops. Mostly because I don't think I have the most friendly face for people to approach for help. Even though I'm a girl, I'm taller, around 5'5", 5'6", taller than most girls at least, broad shoulders, and I resemble my father, who doesn't have the most welcoming face either. But me, I'm a bleeding heart, and I never want to be rude to people. But in this situation, I would have been if it hadn't been out of the blue. When I'm in situations that are new to me, I tend to freeze up and can't think straight. I don't know how to act or what to do in these situations. As you can guess, I'm a big introvert and socially awkward, but I don't have a problem telling people to fuck off. But in this situation, I'm outright panicking and just want to get away from this weird woman. And I say weird because the head injury she mentioned, she didn't have one, not even a bruise, and she was talking so fast and non-stop, I couldn't even tell her I couldn't help her or even try. For some reason at that moment, being polite was more important than getting away. So I'm standing there, exhausted to my bones, about to shove the little money I have at her, when my mother walks in. My badass mother comes right over and says what I can't say and tells me to come to her. The woman takes a step back and I realize how close she was. I hadn't even noticed that she was steadily coming closer as she was talking. She tells my mother how beautiful and nice I was, when really I looked like a greasy mess, as I don't really care about my appearance when I take a road trip. My mother doesn't really respond, and she has me by my arm walking towards the bathroom, asking if I'm okay. That woman got the fuck out of there and goes the opposite direction of where she said her car was. Looking back on it all, at the time I thought she was just weird, and I was certainly weirded out by all of it, but I just thought whatever. But after listening to YouTube, Let's Not Meet, and the such, I realized how lucky I was 2 years later that situation hadn't escalated. I think the reason why she approached me was because I had a wad of money in my hand. They were folded and looked like I had a lot more than I really did. I probably only had $6 on me. And because it was probably obvious to her how tired I was and how much of an easy score she could have gotten. In my tired, grumpy state, she probably planned to rob me. So if any of you reading this, I hope you aren't planning on traveling alone. But if you are, be careful of people, even completely normal looking ones. You can never be too careful, especially all the people looking for an easy score. So weird woman who was lying through her teeth, wanting the $6 in my hand. Let's not meet again. When I was roughly 13, a very close friend of mine invited me and my sister to come to her and her sister's birthday party at a campground. Megan and I were walking around the campground, just messing around, with our sisters following somewhere behind us. The adults knew what we were doing, and we live in a relatively small town, so they knew most of the people at the campground, so it wasn't weird for us to be allowed to walk around the loop. We passed the camper when we were nearing the pond they had there. Megan said she knew the people who were staying there, and they had a girl who was close to our age, and she had a brother. We stopped by and asked if the girl wanted to walk with us. She accepted, and we were off again. I don't remember the girl's name, but she kept on mentioning her brother and how he told her that he thought I was cute when we stopped by the camper. We walked to the pond and probably played in it a bit, then started walking back towards the girl's camper. When we get there, she said to me, "Wait, my brother texted me. He wants to talk to you." He comes out and tells me I'm pretty, and we exchange numbers. The next day we're texting when I asked him his age. He was 19. I tell him I'm 13, and he says, "It doesn't matter, and I can still be his girlfriend." I remember feeling weird after that. I just ended up blocking him after a few days of him texting me and me hardly replying, hoping that he would stop. On Sunday, my best friend, my boyfriend, and I went camping about 20 miles from where I live. We got there around noon and set up a spot. My boyfriend and I had to sleep in a tent and my best friend in the car. We were having a wonderful day and a good time, drinking and smoking weed and eating lots of good snacks, just dicking around. It got dark and super cold, so we went to the car to warm up for a bit and listen to some music. My boyfriend had a lot of Jameson and some beers and really wanted to take the flashlights and explore the small mountain next to our site. I'm an anxious person, and even more when I'm inebriated, so I'm panicking a bit, but he assures me that it'll be a quick walk, and we had service, so I know I could call or text him. He comes back about 20 minutes later. We got into the tent and he says, "Shit didn't feel right." I asked him what he meant, and he said that he wasn't alone out there. Now, he's had a slew of supernatural experiences throughout his life, so it's not uncommon to hear these things from him. He said we were okay because he talked to him. He just kept repeating, if we respect his lands, he'll respect us. There's so much more in this world and this life than just us, but we're safe. If we respect the land, they will respect us. He basically reiterated the same point in different ways. Then he would smile and try to assure me everything was fine. I told him he was scaring me because I do believe him, but because he was also drunk, it seemed like he was almost in a dreamlike state. We'd lay down to get warm because it was fucking cold. I started hearing footsteps and scratching around the tent, but nothing was there. After a few minutes, my anxiety got the best of me, and we packed up and went home. I'm not sure how much he remembers, and I'm too afraid to ask. My 25-year-old female friend from college told me a harrowing story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She is from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent. As the sun went down, the girls noticed that their neighbors a few cabins down, a group of guys similar in age, were playing music and grooving around the campfire, drinking beers. One of the guys asked them if they wanted to join. When they got over there and started hanging out with the guys, everything seemed completely normal, and they were having a fun time. As the night progressed, one of the guys started getting blackout drunk and eventually pulled out a revolver that he said belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually, he started pointing the gun to his head and laughing, while his friends were yelling at him to put it away and how it was not funny. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed and told the guys that they should get back to their cabin and said their goodbyes. When they got back to their cabin, they all talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for the drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation and forgot about it for the time being. A few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, a barrage of cop cars showed up on the scene. One officer came to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin they visited earlier that night. My friends asked the officer what happened. He explained that the kid had shot himself in the head in front of his friends. They were unable to discern if it was suicide or accidental. My friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that's why she rarely goes camping anymore. I know the story may sound fictional. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell them, but I can assure you that the only other person involved also witnessed what occurred that strange night. This happened 11 years ago with my ex-girlfriend. It actually changed our relationship for the worse, and we ended up breaking up a few weeks later. Nonetheless, I still remember this like it was yesterday due to how unexplainable it was. My girlfriend at the time wanted to surprise me with what she said was an overnight surprise trip. I obliged. It felt like a pretty lucky guy for her to do something that required so much planning. After packing a duffel bag full of clothes and toiletries, we left for what I thought was a resort or some kind of hotel stay. 2.5 hours passed when we pulled off the main road and headed down an off-road path. I asked her if this was a camping trip, and she replied, yes. To be honest, I was a little disappointed, as I didn't really like going camping, and not to mention, I wish I would have known to pack my hiking shoes. I didn't complain, of course, because it was still a romantic gesture. 15 minutes on this road, we finally pulled into a camping ground. The first thing I noticed was that there really wasn't anyone around us. It made sense though. This is really far off the beaten path. I was actually surprised our car made it that far, considering how harsh the road was. Anyway, we make a fire pit and she cooks dinner. Everything is going just fine, and we're really feeling each other. We of course take out the tent as the sun goes down, and we're vibing off each other. Yeah, it's what you would expect would happen as we began moving things along as young college-age kids do. This is where the first strange occurrence happens. I hear scratching noises on the side of the tent. I try to remember if we set our tent up next to brush. Maybe the wind was causing branches to rustle against the tent. Oh well, that's the woods. Maybe it's a bird or something else. It stops rustling, and we continue chilling as if nothing happened. Then things escalate in a strange manner. It's like the wind stopped and the environment became silent. We both felt super uneasy, causing us to sort of get knocked out of our playful mood. She laid next to me as we were trying to concentrate on listening to hear if it was a bear or some other animal in the area. Then it happened in an instant. Something like an explosion hit our tent tremendously hard. I could compare it to, say, if a log was thrown like a battering ram against the side of the tent. I say this because it literally pushed the material in forcefully and felt dangerous. A surge of adrenaline lit through my body as I felt like something violent was outside the tent. I never knew if I was a fight or flight guy, but I guess my next action gives me some idea. I yelled aloud, "Give me the knife and the flashlight," as I scrambled up to unzip the tent with tools in hand. My first thought was that I was going to confront some psycho that was messing with us with a baseball bat or some kind of battering weapon. I kid you not, I launched myself out of the tent, stood up in a flurry to confront my attacker. A few breaths pass as the cold feeling sets in. I do a 360 scan to nothing but silence and darkness. Maybe it was a branch that fell on the tent. There was absolutely nothing on the ground where the thud was heard and felt. "Hello? Hello?" I yelled again. And again, no response. Until a moment later, in the silence, a chill shot up my spine. "Get the keys and get out of the tent," I said in a frantic tone as my girlfriend listened and now joined me. I looked at her car that we arrived in and noticed it was about 30 yards out by the soddy off-road path. She didn't even need to know what I was thinking as we both just started speed walking towards it. You might think at this point that I'm just overreacting, but truly I cannot describe the terror that washed over me when I looked out into the darkness after investigating the tent. I could feel like something was watching me, and to top it off, it was eerily silent. I know she confirmed my suspicions when she started for the car immediately without question. Our instincts were telling us to get the hell out of there. The walk to the car was unnerving, and it felt like a football field away, but we finally got to the car. With keys in hand, I took the driver's seat. After turning the key led to some relief that the engine started. Instinctively, I locked the doors and turned the headlights on. We sat for about 3 seconds trying to rationalize what just happened when my girlfriend started exclaiming, "My laptop is moving. Something is in the tent." She said this because she brought her laptop to serve as a lantern after dark. We, of course, left it in a hurry, as well as other items. I saw what she saw. It was being rustled around 30 yards away. Without further hesitation, I put the car in gear and started down the rough road. As I tried to calmly drive her car down the dirt path quickly but carefully, the strangest thing happened next. A loud piercing ringing noise from inside the car's cabin. I turned the radio on and off. I checked the windows. I asked my girlfriend if her car ever made such noises, which she replied, no. I asked her again if she could hear it, as maybe it was just me being under stress, and she said, yes, I hear it. I don't know what it is, in a confused, panicked tone. Now, I wanted to write this off as a car problem, but if you were in there with me, you would describe it as some kind of bell continuously ringing. It didn't sound like any car noise I had ever heard. My next instinct, as I grew up a pastor's kid, I just remember praying for about 10 minutes or so, as I convinced myself it was something supernatural or demonic. We endured the screech for about 10 grueling minutes, and as to my relief, it ended suddenly. It didn't fade out or just go quiet. The loud ringing literally stopped in an instant. I can't describe the feeling in the car when it stopped. It's so strange to look back and remember that I felt internally that the ordeal was over once the ring stopped. Everything felt normal. The panic, the chills, all of it went away in an instant. We ended up going down a road another 45 minutes and finally stopped at a trucker's diner. We slept in the parking lot, or at least she did. I was still on edge from the adrenaline dump I just went through. In attempted bravery, the next day we went back to the camping site as the sun was up. We investigated, but saw no tracks or anything except for the contents of the tent tossed about and still accounted for. I was hoping they were missing so we could write it off as people screwing with us and plundering our tent, but that didn't seem to be the case. We were packed up and gone in less than 10 minutes as the area still felt weird. Haven't been camping since. I would go again, but next time I want an RV, or at least a relatively known location with others around. This place was in the remote mountains of Payson, Arizona, far from civilization. Edit for people asking why this led to a breakup. For starters, after struggling to stay awake on the drive home, after hardly sleeping in the diner's parking lot, I was a bit cranky and mad about her dragging me out camping when I specifically told her I didn't like camping. She didn't take my statement well and said I was ungrateful. To her credit, she planned a nice gesture, unbeknownst to her, that we were going to get haunted. She also kept saying that she wasn't going to give up on camping and that I should give it another shot. I felt that was insensitive, as I told her repeatedly that I'm not interested in going out again, and that also I wish she would have communicated that was what we were doing ahead of time, so that I could have brought a gun or something, other than a little knife. It probably wasn't right of me to act like the incident was her fault, as it wasn't. The reality was that we had only been dating for about a month and a half, and I felt like I was trying to fit a mold of a person that she wanted to marry. As she made comments about she wanted her kids, family to go camping together and whatnot. So plunging me into the deep end and wanting me to go again even shortly after the incident, moving too fast for me. Also, a hiking incident happened a month later that broke the camel's back. This was when we were on a break but still talking to each other, but it solidified our breakup. It wasn't a haunting, but it was scary and dangerous, as she didn't tell me that we were going mountaineering and not hiking. Loose rocks falling, free climbing up 50-foot semi-cliffs, nothing I was prepared for. She deserved a great outdoorsman, and that wasn't me. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, back when I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off. So we did have neighbors, though they were roughly a kilometer away from each other. We loved it because of the privacy. It wasn't like there was nobody nearby that I couldn't go to if I needed help. That, though, is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m. sometimes, fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went on a walk at 2 a.m. because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid, and after this incident, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again. always making sure there was at least some sunlight left when I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was in the open, in front of the other farms, including my own. If anything happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good, so I would have been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching a full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, and it was during this part of the walk that I had my creepy encounter. It was late at night. I can't remember what time exactly, but it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help, help, help. It was a monotone voice repeatedly asking for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help, help. A very stupid part of me almost responded because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, even though I would have been around 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, my brain kicked in and I realized that approaching that voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do. So I started quickly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat followed me on the walk and wasn't backing away with me. She was walking towards the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case it hadn't noticed me yet. But I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forward, grabbed her, then turned around and bolted it back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid for me to turn my back to the voice, as I was making so much noise while running that there was no way they didn't know I was there, and I had no way of knowing if they had given chase. I was so fucking terrified the whole time. The image of someone cloaked in the shadows chasing me entered my mind, even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me. I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my house. It doesn't end there though. Despite how terrifying it was, there's still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was, because what if they really needed help? I asked my mother to drive us to the location. Another very stupid decision, considering what we found. That being nothing. We called out, but nobody answered. We didn't get out of the car though. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home, having seen nothing and no one, but it still bothered me the next morning, so I had my mother drive us over there again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing. No indication that someone had been there. There was no body, which admittedly was a drastic thing to search for. I don't know if I would prefer this outcome, because at least then I would have had a face to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day, I have no idea who that voice belonged to and why they were calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep. Rapist, kidnapper, serial killer, all the classic horror stories, but I guess I'll never really know for sure. This may be more of a near encounter, but it was still unsettling. My partner and I decided we were going to go hiking on a trail in a national forest area yesterday. It was a fairly remote area, and we drove a variety of dirt roads to get there. But we were excited to hike during the beautiful times of the year, with the leaves changing. The trailheads had some small parking area, which was approximately 200 feet before the river crossing and bridge. As we pulled into the parking area, we noticed about 5 people on the other side of the river embankment across the bridge. They were all standing there in a neutral stance, spread legs, arms straight out, either facing the direction or the opposite direction, with their feet nearly touching. It was difficult to tell the distance. There's maybe a slight gap in the road for a car to pass through, but they took up most of the road. They were wearing all black, and it looked like they might have had black masks on too, as we couldn't see any color or features indicative of faces. As we pulled into the parking area, my partner and I pondered what was going on over there. We stared at them for about 10 seconds, and we discovered that they were completely motionless, like statues. At this point, both of our guts were raising alarms, and we decided to hightail it out of there. As we drove away, they continued to stand there motionless. Thankfully, no one followed us. We're still trying to figure out what happened there. Was it a hunting group? If so, why weren't they wearing orange? Was it a teenage group playing a prank? Was it just our overactive imaginations? Just as a friendly reminder, there is a problem of people disappearing in national parks and forests, so be sure to stay safe and vigilant. My boyfriend and I camped through California, and we stayed at a campsite near Santa Barbara for 2 nights. The first night, it was just us and another camper across from us, and the second night, it was only us at the campground. There wasn't much near the campground, and it was like a 30 minutes drive into Santa Barbara. It had started raining around 2 a.m., which woke me up a little bit, and I was just laying there trying to go back to sleep. I was almost asleep when I heard what sounded like a car crash. I lay there for a second and then decided to ask my boyfriend if he was awake. He answered, so I asked him if he heard what I heard. He said yes, and he decided to check it out to make sure they were okay. We get out of the tent and grab our flashlights and start walking where we thought we heard the wreck happen, when a person hops back in their truck, turns their lights on, and frantically leaves the campground. This freaks my boyfriend and I out because the person was driving the wrong way through the campground without headlights on towards our campsite, and we were the only ones there. The camp was lined with large rocks, and that's what he ran into. The fact that he was creeping right past the campground like that makes me and my boyfriend believe that he had bad intentions. We didn't sleep much for the rest of the night. So I live in a cul-de-sac in a suburban neighborhood with a medium-sized wooded area behind my house. My bedroom is literally next to the back sliding glass door, and every night I can hear something large moving around back there. All my cats and dogs are inside, so I know it's not them. It'll be slowly moving around back there, and then stop. I'll say something loudly, and then it'll start up again. Sometimes it will move even faster, which makes me go back inside. I don't believe it's a wolf because I've only had one encounter with one in my 12 years living here. Usually I hear wolves howling at night, but it's always from far away. I've been back in those woods during the day and seen nothing, not even a snake. It only happens in the dead of night. There's a legendary Bigfoot-like creature, known as the Flintville Monster, that has been spotted since it was seen and shot by cops in the 1970s, but that community is several miles away. I don't know what it could be. This happened to a group of friends and I on a camping expedition for a reward program. It was the second day, and we were coming to the end of a 6-hour walk. We were walking across a small country road. The nearest house was pretty far behind us and way out of earshot. At the end of the country road was a bridleway that ran perpendicular, probably about 2 miles from a nearby village. As we were approaching the bridleway, an unmarked white van came up the road, and instead of stopping, he pulled in front of us. The width of the van was about the size of the country road, so we couldn't get past. He rolled down his window and started asking us questions. It wasn't uncommon for the locals to ask us questions or give us words of encouragement, but this guy didn't sit right with me. Being an all-female group, and not to mention all of us were incredibly exhausted. This was a concern of mine. I brushed it off since I didn't want to worry anyone else. I figured I just watched too many true crime documentaries. He asked us what we were doing, as many people had. We explained the award program that we were on. His questions began relatively normal and small talkish, but then began to get more specific. So you're camping out tonight then? We replied and said we were. Ready for him to drive off so we could continue our route. Where's your campsite? This sent shivers down my spine. This may not have been anything sinister, but it was none of his business. I feigned ignorance, as if I didn't know where the campsite was, and gestured vaguely in the opposite direction of the site. Again, I was expecting him to shrug this off and just go about his day. But no. Surely you know where your campsite is. This is when one of my best friends blurted out the name of the campsite. I froze for a second, but luckily he didn't hear this. He began to ask us questions like, is it near? Is it that way? What does it look like? This was far too specific for my liking, so I maintained that I had no idea. Eventually, he began to drive away, looking strangely disappointed, without saying anything. We waited until he was down the road, and we continued walking, a little shaken. We made it back to the campsite and reported it to the counselor. I didn't get any sleep that night. Maybe I was overreacting, but I dreaded to think what could have happened. It finally started raining here, so I took my 14-year-old son out mushroom hunting over the weekend. It was later than we normally would go, and the sun goes down much earlier. But we were taking a trail to the river and back in the hopes of finding turkey tails or chanterelle mushrooms. We took the wrong turn and ended up going through a big field, which the trail would take us back around to the main trail to the river. As we walked towards the main trail, the last group of people had left, and it was just me and my son. We walked along and out the thicket side trail came this weird man. He had his dog with him that was alert at his side. He was staring at us as we walked closer towards him. Then he started waving at us, this really weird, slow wave. I was immediately uncomfortable and got goosebumps, but didn't want to be impolite, so I half-hearted waved back at him, while staring back, telling my son to slow up a little. I didn't want to actually meet up at the junction. After a full minute of us dawdling, the guy slowly turned and began to walk down the trail towards the main trail. I was warily walking, didn't want to go too fast, and we stopped to look at some plants, so the guy and his dog got further down the trail, which curved to the right and continued down on 2 blocks to the junction. I was thinking, if this was a creepy let's not meet, this dude would be waiting around the corner, and sure enough, he was just standing at the junction, off to the left towards the parking lot, and to the right was a half-mile trail to the river. The dude was just standing there, with his dog, staring at us, not moving at all. Both my son and I were like, holy shit, let's keep wide to the right. And saying that he looks old, we could run faster than him, and just planning for the freaky deaky, just in case. He kept staring at us, so as we approached, I asked if he was okay, and he just kept staring back. He had greasy hair, teeny round glasses, a blue windbreaker, plaid-along shorts, about 50 years old. His dog was a small beagle mix. He didn't answer me at all, just kept staring. We turned to the right and walked about a block. I had my phone cam facing me so I could watch him over my shoulder, and the only movement I saw from him was slowly shifting his direction to continue to stare at us. I didn't say anything else to him. It was moderately unsettling, his stare, made more so by the lack of response, emotionless face, weird teeny glasses, slow wave at us. He did leave because on our way back, he was no longer standing there on the main trail. So hey, freaky deaky forest zombie dude. For sure stay in the thickets and let's not meet. This happened to me today. I had a couple friends decide to go hiking in a local forest, but this time we decided to take a different route for variety. We walked for about an hour. We were a little over a kilometer deep in the forest. Nothing unusual happened until at one point, we started hearing some weird sounds and music like a religious ceremony. We got freaked out and decided to start heading back. On the way back, we heard a bunch of other weird noises. But at that point, our minds were probably playing tricks on us. After the earlier encounter, we got home safely. I checked Google Maps in the direction where the sounds came from, but there was nothing but more woods. I don't know what happened, so I'm asking if you people have any possible explanations. This happened almost 25 years ago, way before cell phones were a popular thing. When I was 17, my brother, 13 at the time, and I were traveling into northern British Columbia in mid-November. This is important, as the darkness at this time of the year in the mountains is absolute. We were in Pine Pass between Chetwynd and Prince George, BC. Anyone who knows this area knows how desolate it is. I'm talking about hundreds of kilometers between gas stations and any kind of people or buildings. We were just about at the Powder King Ski Resort turnoff, and it was getting late. We pulled into a roadside turnout around 10:30 p.m. because I was super tired. My brother was already sleeping. I pull in and park near some tourist signage, lock my doors, and put my seat back to sleep. I was dead asleep when something snapped me awake. To this day, I'm not sure what it was that woke me up. I was looking around, trying to figure out what was happening, when all of a sudden my car was surrounded by 4 or 5 men. They started yanking at my door handles, trying to get into the car. I'm not sure if they saw that I was awake or not, but I sat up and slammed the car into drive and peeled out of there. I'm not sure if I hit one of them or not, and I didn't care to check. I didn't stop again until my auntie's house in Prince George. Was one of the 3 most terrifying times in my life. So to the 4 or 5 men in Pine Pass who tried to get in the car with 2 kids, I hope I at least ran one of your feet over.
My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk, which drops deep down to the bottom of the forest. No other cars were in the parking lot, and we didn't come across any other hikers. We had it all to ourselves and had a great time, for the most of it. As we were walking up, my ex was ahead of me and suddenly stopped, raising his hand to signal for me to stop with him. I looked up, and there was this woman standing up ahead of us, staring right back. She looked normal, but I got a chill as soon as I saw her. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasted so strongly against her cardigan. And her cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, totally clean, as if it had just been bought off the rack. I thought about how ridiculous it was to wear while hiking. We stood there totally motionless, just staring back at her for what was probably only about 30 to 40 seconds, but felt like a lifetime. We didn't feel immediately threatened, but there was no way I was going to take a step towards her. Instead, I felt this weird kind of stillness, as if the forest around us froze in time and went silent. She finally turned around and started to walk slowly back up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying a word to each other, until she was well out of sight, before we began walking again. The parking lot was still around half an hour away, and we walked in silence, both a bit on edge and trying to listen for any suspicious sounds. We didn't see her or anyone else for the rest of the trail, and still, no cars were in the parking lot when we returned. It was absolutely the strangest experience I've ever had in the outdoors.
A few years back, probably in my junior year of high school, I was hunting with a guy my mom was dating. He was a strange character in of himself, such as talking about wanting to kill a bear with a knife just to be able to say he did it. I'm not much of a hunter, but I like to go sit in the woods and relax, and if all I gotta do is hold a gun to do that, sign me up. Anyhow, this guy led me deep into the woods. Felt like we walked for a mile, and I get set up by a tree, and he sort of walks off to find his own spot. So I'm just sitting there by myself, enjoying the peace, and about an hour or two passes. I start hearing twigs and such snapping, like someone was walking behind me. I take a quick glance back, thinking he's finally coming back to get me, but it was not him. There's a guy in a sweater and khakis, who upon reflection looked a lot like the human version of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. I just turned back around thinking he's gonna keep walking, but he comes up right behind me and stood there for what felt like 10 minutes before finally saying, "You out here by yourself?" Which is the wrong thing to ask a stranger in the woods, cause I was freaked out. I basically just pointed to a random direction and said that there was someone over there with me. He went back to standing quietly. Meanwhile, I'm thinking it might be time to flip off the safety on my rifle, but without saying a word, he just turned around and walked off again. Needless to say, I couldn't get comfortable for the rest of the time in the woods that day. The guy I was out there with didn't see him and probably thought I was just making this shit up for a good story, but that still freaks me out to this day.
This story happened in July. My husband and I decided to take our 2 kids camping one weekend since we can't do much else ever since Corona. Plus, we love camping and have never taken them before. Our daughter is 2 and our son is 6. We went to our usual place where the campsites are about half a mile away from each other. Well, once it started to get dark, our kids started getting scared and wanted to leave, so we decided to take them to my dad's for the weekend. And when we went back to the campsite around midnight, we decided it was time to go to bed. We lied down and fell asleep rather quickly, and around an hour or 2 later, I woke up because I had to pee. I woke my husband up, and we walked together to the bathroom, which was about halfway between campsites. On our way back, we saw a light coming from our campsite, which kind of worried us, making us think our family was looking for us. So we walked back quickly towards the campsite, but right before we did, we got out of the trees and my husband threw his arm to stop me. I asked him what, and he simply shushed me. I stayed quiet and looked back at the campsite. I watched the light when I finally noticed a glint of silver in their hand. A long knife. We ducked down and hid behind some trees, and in typical scary movie fashion, the guy heard us move and shined his light towards the woods. That's when he started running towards us, and we took off running in the opposite direction. We could hear him running behind us, and we kept checking as much as we could. At one point, we noticed the light was gone. We eventually were able to circle to the road and crept slowly back to my husband's SUV. We got back in and drove as fast as we could and called the police. They had us take them back to the campsite, and we waited in the car while they checked the campsite and the surrounding area. Soon, we saw more police cars pull up, and the 2 original officers came up to us and asked us to walk to the tent with them. We did, and what we saw was shocking. Our tent was slashed to pieces, and so was all of our stuff. The police ended up evacuating all the other campers and did a sweep of the entire area, but didn't find anything except for the flashlight that was along the way we ran. We follow up with the police every month, and there have been no updates. I will post if anything new comes up.
Okay, so this happened to me when I was 17. My now fiance and I lived in the mountains and used to smoke up the green often at this point. We decided to go up to our favorite parkway to smoke a bit. I talked about this parkway in a post about a year ago, but let me explain real fast. The parkway has a long road up a mountain which pulls off to look either at the mountains or down at the city. We went to our favorite pull off, which is about 25 minutes up the mountain. We smoked and hung out a while. Unfortunately, we didn't realize how fast it was getting dark and the cold front moving in. At that moment in time, I felt confident that I was sober enough to be able to drive home without a problem. So we started heading our way down. Long story short, I found out real fast that I was overconfident and was still too high to drive down. So I asked my fiance if I could stop and pull over, sober up a bit more, which he was perfectly fine with. So this is where the story starts. I pull off at the next one I see, and a car is already parked there. We parked about 15 feet away, and it happened so fast that I couldn't even get a full breath in. My fiance goes, "What are they doing?" And when I look over at the guy in the car, it looks like he's on top of someone. Fiance says there's a girl in the car as well that I didn't see. What was really weird is it honestly looked like he was choking the girl, but we couldn't tell. I mean, no judgment, maybe it was something they were into, but our high minds were like, fuck that. I told him what I saw and was gonna start driving, but it was gonna be slow, so just bear with me. Again, unfortunately life always has other fucking plans. The pull-off we went into had one exactly across the other side of the street, where we didn't see a black GMC truck sitting there. Well, right when I was about to pull out, the truck was weirdly already waiting for me to pull out, with its headlights off. It's completely dark at this point. Right when I pull onto the road, he turns his lights on, and is immediately on my bumper. At this point, I am high as fuck, freaking out, trying to get down this mountain. Anyways, he followed me all the way down the mountain, not even backing up a little bit. I get on the highway, and the truck is pulling in front of us, trying to get us to slow down, and keeps flickering his turning signals back and forth to get me to pull over. This happens for about 2 minutes before my fiance goes, "Slow down to 10 miles per hour," which is dangerous on a road like that. He had his reasons why he thought it was a good idea, I just don't remember. But once I did, the truck quickly sped away really fast. It didn't make any sense, and we think there's a chance the people could have been messing with us. And I have no idea if seeing the guy choking someone and then being followed by another car were related, but it was weird. I definitely don't smoke and drive anymore.
So, I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to relax there, you had to work for it. The fire crew that I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours up a really windy, mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. Regarding my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple, but my supervisor from the crew had experienced some weird things as well as working up there. There was one night, he told me he was cowboy camping, which is basically sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird mucus-type drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so it wasn't any tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe he was telling me the truth. Now, for my story, I have had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of 4th of July, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but felt awake still, and I hear one of my coworkers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side, facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me. I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice.
Get the fuck outside.
I lay frozen, not moving, while they yelled at me. Eventually, it stopped, and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but nevertheless, still weird.
Years ago, I was walking my dog with my sister at a farm right by my house. The farm owner, a nice lady who still runs it today, let the public use their farm and woods for free to walk their dogs as long as the dogs stayed on their leads when by the farm animal pens and fields. The farm was quite big, and if you walk further in, there's little woods at the back of it which are normally quite deserted. We always feel safe walking here though, because we've both known the farm owner since we were babies, and the walls surrounding the farm are massive and couldn't be easily climbed over, if that makes sense. Anyway, we go into the farm and make our way to the woods, because in the woods we can let our dog off the lead. After we let him off his lead, he starts walking around. The woods go in a big circle around the farm, so we usually just do a lap of the woods before coming back into the farm and going home. We were walking along chatting, and then sitting ahead of us on a fallen down tree log was a man. He was just sitting there. What I mean is, he wasn't drinking coffee he had bought from the little farm shop at the farm. He didn't have a dog with him. He was just sitting on a log staring straight ahead at the trees and the woods. We carry on walking, and as we come close to him, he suddenly looks over at us quite quickly and says, "The only way out of this place is over there," in this monotone voice, and points at the woods, which is a part of the woods that just leads to more woods and then to a brick wall that surrounded the farm. We just ignored him and carried on walking. We told the lady who owns the farm that there was a man in the woods, and she said she hadn't seen anyone go in there before us, but asked us nevertheless what he was doing. We said he wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, but we did tell her what he said to us. She looked confused and went into the woods with us and asked us to show her where he had been, so we did. We showed her where he had pointed, and she said, "That leads to the wall that used to separate the farm and the railroad tracks." Apparently, years before there was a railway next to the farm that just stopped being used for whatever reason, some 30 years before. Now just sits there overgrown and desolate. Don't know what that man meant about that being the only way out of the woods, but the whole thing made me feel unnerved. We never saw him again, and neither did the farm owner. Several months ago, I had a bit too much to drink with some friends. I arrived back to my car around 12 a.m. and I decided I wasn't in any condition to drive. I grabbed whatever blankets and jackets I had, curled up in the back seat and fell asleep. Around 4 a.m. I woke up hungover, but much more sober than before. I reached to the front and started my car to warm up. As I sat back down, I looked out the rearview window and saw a man. He was wearing a dark hoodie with a red backpack on. He was standing under a streetlight, staring at me from the middle of the parking lot. I was confused. It was dark and I thought I was just seeing things, but then he started walking towards my car. I have never jumped into the driver's seat with such swiftness in my life. I swear my heart felt like it stopped. He proceeded to stop and just stood there, watching me drive away. It still makes me feel uneasy to this day. I like to believe that he was not watching me sleep, but needless to say, I will not be sleeping in my car ever again. Before I began, this encounter happened about 10 years ago. I was 22 years old, and I am well aware that this was a very poor judgment call on my part. My parents always taught me to help someone in need, just not necessarily to the extent that I allowed. Up until this point, I didn't really have much reason not to trust people, and that they may not always have good intentions. I have also had an unreasonably difficult time saying no to people my whole life, and have since had the help of a therapist to be better about that. I've only told this story to a handful of people because I'm truly ashamed of my actions and potentially putting my daughter's life in danger. I was on my way to an event of some kind with my 3-year-old daughter when I realized I had left something behind in my apartment. I was close enough to home that I decided to turn around and head home. As I was pulling into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a woman was walking kind of in the middle of the driving area and began waving me down. I pulled up next to the woman and rolled down my window about 1/3 of the way. She gave me this story about how she works nearby at a nursing home and how she had ran out of gas on her way to the gas station and was asking for directions to the gas station. I didn't think much of the fact that she was roaming around an apartment complex because it was pretty common for people to cut through, as it sat between 2 main roads and avoids traffic lights. I gave her directions for a 5-minute walk to the gas station, but then she mentioned that she was pregnant and that she wasn't feeling well. I tried telling her I was in a hurry and assured her that it would be a quick walk, but she begged. At this time, she noticed that my daughter was in the back seat. She had a look of surprise that I didn't think much of at the time, and she began talking to my daughter and made her laugh. She turned back to me and asked one last time if I could drive her to the gas station. At this point, I just gave in. I let her in my car, and she almost immediately asked if I have any money that she can use. My heart sank at this point, realizing that she was probably just lying and just wanted to lie her way into some cash. I was honest with her and told her that I was broke and that I also didn't carry cash on me. She pointed out another resident in the complex and asked me to drive her to them. In my mind, there was still a slight possibility that she needed gas, but she didn't have the funds for it. So I drive her to the other person, and she rolled down my window asking for money. They said no, and she pointed out another person. At this time, I told her that I really had to be somewhere, and I couldn't keep helping her. I drove her closer to the other person, but far enough that she would have to get out to talk to them, which thankfully she did. Once she got out of my car, I sped off and drove to my destination. Told my mother about the story, and a week later she sent me a clip from the local news. The news mentioned a woman who would approach people asking for a simple favor, which led her to asking them for money. If these people said no, she pulled out a syringe or needle of some kind and would threaten to stab them with it, and even did end up stabbing them on one occasion. I look at the image of the person and instantly recognize this woman that was in my car. I know these type of people don't have much of a conscience, but I truly believe the fact that my daughter was in the car with me that day is what kept the woman from stabbing me. I believe this was April 2018. I had gone to Colorado for a concert and was just driving around checking everything out before and after. The day before the concert, I'm driving through the Rockies because I thought it'd be cool, I guess. It was probably already around 9 p.m. at this point. I get to a gas station and there's an old lady with a giant suitcase. I went inside, bought a pack of Swishers, got gas, and as I was leaving, she asked me for a ride. Being young and stupid, I said sure, hop in ma'am. Then she had me get her giant suitcase in my back seat, and we were off. The ride seemed pretty normal at first, just talked about life. She did most of the talking, mostly about her kids and family. She claimed that she was hitchhiking to Alaska for some insane reason I can't remember. Anyways, I had a joint that I just decided to give her and let her smoke while we were driving. Not really sure why. Maybe to get her to shut up a little bit. Eventually, she asked if I want to try her weed, but keeps mentioning how it tastes funny, which was a red flag, so I politely said no. Then she started getting weird, talking about homeless camps where people smoked meth. Then I actually got a good look at her and realized she was probably like a 40-year-old tweaker and not as old as I originally thought she was. Also, I think I saw an Adam's apple. She starts pointing out rest stop signs or whatever, which are like 100 miles out, and was trying to convince me to go to one with her. She kept saying, I don't have any money, but some people will have to suck your dick if you give them a ride. At this point, I'm actually driving like a maniac in the middle of a pretty bad snowstorm at the time, in hopes that I'm more visible and noticeable if anything were to happen. I was terrified for my life. I politely refused all her sexual and drug-related advances. Finally, we get to a town on the opposite side of the Rockies from Denver, and I pull up to a gas station and say, okay, I gotta go back to Denver and get some sleep. I'm dropping you off here. All she said was, you're a smart young man, and I helped her unload her suitcase and left, thanking God I was still breathing. If any of my actions are questioned, this was a time in my life when I was particularly lost and not in a good mental state at all. I definitely shouldn't have been roaming Colorado by myself. Smaller guy, no weapon aside from a knife. I'm incredibly lucky. So yesterday I spent a day out with a couple of friends of mine, going an hour away to the next city to meet up and hang out there. Because it's fall now, of course it gets pretty dark early and it's inevitable to drive home in the dark. Well, I don't know the area very well in the city and had to use Google Maps for directions, which seemed to take us through the back roads where, in of itself, is very creepy. We had just left from watching a horror movie too, which didn't help our nerves having noticed that some asshole with LED bright lights kept following us at every single turn. Of course, my friends and I were trying not to panic, but the guy followed us for quite a few miles and possibly flashing his lights at us to tell us something. I wanted to test it and go down a road that wasn't the direction given by Google Maps, but I was worried that it would end up in a dead end and my suspicions would be right that they were following us. I couldn't see the car at all aside from the headlights, so I have no idea what it was or who it was. Thankfully, once we got closer to the highway, he seemed to finally trail off and turn somewhere else. You can bet your ass I had a panic attack right afterwards, including hyperventilating due to the built-up tension. Moral of the story, trust your gut and don't go down any back roads at night. I would like to share my own story that I found incredibly strange and frightening at the time. I'm a female, I was probably 14 at the time. I was walking to school and wanted to get some snacks before I went, and I got to my parents' permission to spend a little bit of cash. As I was walking down, this lady in a blue car honked her horn at me, which made me jump slightly, so I looked her way and asked her if she was alright. She kinda just looked at me, and as I continued walking, she pulled forward. I ducked into a shop because I was pretty weirded out by this at this point, kinda panicky. As I left the shop, lo and behold, the lady was no longer in her car, so I bolted down the roads and hid behind a bush by my village. There aren't a whole lot of places to hide in my town, and I was already running late. A couple minutes later, I was still waiting in the bushes, and I see her drive down, looking around while going weirdly slow. She might have just been grocery shopping or something, but it was enough to shake me, and I never saw her or her car ever again after that day. When my daughter was 2, I was having a tough time as a single mother and decided to take a road trip up Highway 1. I made reservations in Trinidad at a cool cabin in the woods within walking distance of the beach. Before I left, my stepfather gave me his loaded .38 revolver, which I stored under the driver's side seat. Sometime after driving through San Francisco, it was very late and dark, and nobody was on the highway. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in her car seat next to me. Back then, you could legally have the car seats in the front. I noticed a car coming up behind me and passed, but then it slowed down, driving alongside me. I sped up and slowed down, but couldn't shake him. I looked over and this guy had his interior light on and was furiously gesturing me to pull over. I knew I had to find a safe place. There was nobody else on the road and I was running low on gas. There was just nothing on this highway for miles. I kept driving, but this guy would not leave me alone. I was getting really frightened, but the mama bear was coming out and I was getting very angry as well. I knew he could see my kid who was still sleeping. Finally, there was an exit up ahead and a gas station in the middle of nowhere, so I took the exit and the guy closely followed me. I wasn't sure what to do. The gas station was brightly lit but had no customers. I didn't feel safe to pull in. I slowly drove past it, driving further into the dark, desolated landscape, and pulled into a large dirt area and drove quite a ways off the highway with him following. Absolutely nothing around. I knew I was in big trouble and needed to take control and wanted to put him in a vulnerable situation. Mama Bear was in full protective mode and I was pissed. I stopped the car, grabbed the gun and jumped out, locking the car behind me. As he pulled up, I ran around to the passenger side and waited. He got out of his car and quickly moved towards me, and I suddenly held the gun up, visible by the moonlight. He came to a halt, surprised, and then I leveled the gun across the car, taking aim. I waited. He stood there, weighing his options, and then turned around, got back in his car and left. Not a word spoken. Totally freaked me out. It was a typical Friday evening, and I was on my way home from work. I was driving my new car, a shiny black sedan that I had just purchased a few weeks earlier. I was feeling pretty good, listening to my favorite music and looking forward to the weekend. As I drove through the city, I noticed a car following me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as we reached the stoplight, the car pulled up next to me, and I saw that there was 2 men inside. They looked rather rough and menacing, and they had their faces covered with bandanas. The light turns green and I moved forward, but the other car stayed right next to me. I tried to shake them off, but they wouldn't budge. I started to feel a sense of unease and started looking for an escape route. Then, just as we were approaching the intersection, the other car swerved in front of me, forcing me to stop. One of the men got out and walked up to my window. He had a gun in his hand and demanded I get out of the car. I just froze. My mind was racing as I was trying to figure out what to do. I knew I couldn't outrun a bullet, but I didn't want to just give up my car without a fight. I hesitated, and the man with the gun grew more aggressive. He shouted at me to get out of the car, and he cocked the gun, making it clear that he meant business. I knew there was no other option, so I complied with his demands and stepped out of the car with my hands up. The man took my keys and jumped in the car and drove off, leaving me standing on the side of the road in shock. Couldn't believe what just happened. I just lost my brand new car, and all of my personal belongings were inside. I walked to the nearest restaurant and used their phone to call the police. I had to file a report, and I gave them all the details I could remember. Luckily, the police took the matter seriously and tried to track my car via the GPS. Later, it was recovered with my CD player and belongings all gone, and they were never caught. The incident left me shaken, but I was relieved that I had not got hurt. Still, the whole experience had been a terrifying reminder of the dangers that lurk on our streets. After that carjacking incident, I took some self-defense classes and learned to be more aware of my surroundings. It's important to always be alert and aware, and also have a plan of what to do in case of an emergency. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, Remember to stay calm, comply, and call the police immediately after. It was a dark and stormy night. I know, cliche. And I was in the rural countryside. It was extremely windy, and the only light for miles came from a faint glow of the moon peeking out behind the clouds. I was driving my beat-up pickup down a deserted country road, heading home after a long day at work. The rain was coming down hard, making it difficult to see a few feet in front of me. I turned the radio on to keep myself company, but the only thing that came through was static. Suddenly, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a big, old rusty truck with a flatbed trailer attached. It looked like it hadn't been driven in years. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but as I got closer, the truck started moving. It was coming straight towards me, with its headlights pretty much blinding me. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the side of the road, but the truck didn't slow down, it just kept coming. I turned around and floored it, trying to put as much distance between me and the truck as possible, but it was no use. The truck was faster, and it was gaining on me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I swerved around corners, trying to shake the truck, but it was always there, right behind me. I could see the driver now, a shadowy figure behind the wheel, but I couldn't make out any details. Finally, I saw a dirt road up ahead and turned onto it, hoping that it would lead me to safety, but the truck followed. It was driving recklessly through the mud, and I could feel my truck shaking as I hit potholes and bounced over the rough terrain. The dirt road led to a dead end, and I slammed my brakes, sliding to a stop. I got out of the truck, running to a small farmhouse. I banged on the door and an older man opened. I told him everything, and he quickly got a shotgun, and we drove back to the spot. We reached the spot where I turned onto the dirt road, but we could not find the truck. We searched for a little bit, but there was no trace. Anyways, I never saw the truck again, but I could never forget the terror of being chased in the dark countryside with no way to escape. Even today, when I drive through rural areas, I can't help but keep a watchful eye out for an old rusty truck, fearing that it will come after me again. Okay, for starters, this happened in July of this year, and it still freaks me out. I was 23 when this happened. It was a hot afternoon and I was going home from my boyfriend's house, who lives about a 15 to 20 minute walk from my home. Since it was scorching heat, I was wearing my bike shorts and an oversized tee with sneakers. As I'm getting about 10 minutes away from my home, I put my headphones on and decide not to rush, as I didn't want to get there just yet because I was enjoying the fresh air. As I'm going to cross the street, a man in a truck, who was also across the street, began catcalling me. I ignored him and waited for the light to change. As I waited, he began getting increasingly more aggressive and overall just wouldn't shut up. The light changes and I make my way across the street. He then proceeds to honk his horn as I'm walking by and says, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Why don't you come with me for the night? I'll treat you real good." I immediately told him to leave me alone and continued on my way, but as I'm walking, he follows me with his truck and keeps trying to get me to go with him. I call my boyfriend and tell him the situation, and he FaceTimes me to see the car and the person who was following me. He then tells me to go into the store and stay there. I do as he said, and not even 2 minutes later after I walk in, the man walks in. He was looking for me. He spots me, and I immediately go to the person behind the counter and tell her the situation. She offers to let me go in the back to call the police. I told her yes and waited. He walks up to the front of the store and asks the lady if she's seen anyone with my description. She immediately says no, and if he's not going to buy anything to please leave, as she had other customers. He begins huffing and puffing, saying that he knows that he saw me. And once again she says to leave and that if he doesn't, she will call the police. That got him and he left. About 5 minutes later, my boyfriend arrives and tells me he's gonna take me home as he feels it's safer. I didn't argue and we leave the store. As we walk out, the man is right there. He looked at us and said, "Oh, so you're gonna tease me with a boyfriend?" Typical. My boyfriend immediately goes into protective mode and gets in the man's face and tells him, "If I ever see you again, if you ever breathe in our direction again, you'll regret it." He then proceeds to punch the man in the groin and walks me back to my house. Sometimes I really hate being a woman.